pretty crazy. Well, so I went ahead and played it smart tonight, and just planned on covering just 2 verses, and then we'll finish up a pretty. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation next week when we look into the providence of God, and so we're still on I'm going to call this part 2 of the issues of forgiveness, and this is not the issues like forgiveness has issues and problems. This is using issues as a verb to say what comes forth from forgiveness, and so that the idea that we talked about last week was when you see evidences of something that's coming out, but you can't see the source of it, are you able, and how easy is it to look at what's coming out of something to identify what is issuing forth of that? So we're looking at the things that issue forth from forgiveness, the things that we see that surround forgiveness, so that even though we're not going to see forgiveness, the word in Philemon, we're going to see everything else around it, that when we look at it all and calculate it and create a bar graph and a line graph for it, we find one. That's for you, Mark. We see an evidence that we're talking about forgiveness. And so let's do a little bit of a recap since I know that Thanksgiving kind of tends to take a toll on all of us. So let's take a look at what we've already talked about. We're talking about the issue of authority, that we saw Paul kind of tell Philemon, I could order you to forgive. I could order you to take back. And so we looked at, what does that mean for us as a church? And we looked at just barely scratched the surface, and I even thought about delving deeper into this idea of what role does the church have on family and work and all that, so that to say, is it likely that when we join a church and join a family of faith that we are putting ourselves in a place of submission to the shepherds of that particular church, so that when a shepherd, a pastor, a leader says, "Hey, I'm seeing something in your life," that we have that authority to call that out and say, "We want you to take a look at this and take note of it," and that we are obligated, and I use that word very loosely, we ought to have the humility to say, I've put myself in this place, so I'm going to listen extra careful and extra hard to those that I have put myself under. We don't think about that a lot, especially in an American church, because we here in America, we like our independence, and we like our, we tend to, and I think this is human nature, we tend to put ourselves on the good side of everything. We had a friend who's had another friend that they were dating, and he was a police officer, and he was caught going through her mail. Well, that's against the law, and he should know that. But something in his mind, in his heart, was saying, it's okay for me to do this. I'm putting myself on and I call it mental gymnastics and spiritual gymnastics. How can we oftentimes put ourselves in this place of, I'm actually on the right side, when we have so many people around us going, hey, careful, warning, right? And so what do we do about that? So the issue of authority when it comes to that. Then we looked at the issue of salvation. So we ultimately went down to issue of authority of a leader comes from the primary issue of authority, which is love. Paul says it's not, I could, but I'm not going to, because I want to appeal to love. I want the authority of love to take precedence over the authority that I have. So the authority of love And so we looked at all these different places where love seems to be that thing that issues forth and says, in an environment that's full of this type of agape love, God life love, is where forgiveness comes out of that. Forgiveness that has no conditions. Forgiveness that has no constraints. It's just given forgiveness, peaceful forgiveness, bearing each other's burdens in love. We'll look more about that tonight. Like-minded love, spurring one another on love. That's the love that we see forgiveness coming forth from. So Paul is saying, I could, but I would rather appeal to the authority of love. So then the next thing we looked at was salvation. And again, just scratch the surface of this idea of salvation. We see evidence in Paul's letter to Philemon that Onesimus accepted Christ. He became a Christian. Well, there's a lot of instances in Scripture where we see people who have accepted Christ and what happens to them. There's a transformation that takes place. And here we looked at we kind of went off on a planned side journey, talking about this idea of union with Christ and the Ordo Salutis, which is this order of salvation. And it's, Paul never knew this word. He knew Latin, but he never knew this word. But what this is kind of us thinking about salvation and saying, okay, what does all this entail for salvation? And we talked about God's sovereignty is involved with salvation. We talked about the atonement of Christ is involved with salvation. The gospel call is part of this salvation, that we can actually hear God calling us and saying, come and be my children. See what the work that I've done, see what Christ has done for you, hear it, see it, experience it, feel it, believe it. And then there's a regeneration of the heart that is part of this Ordo Salutis, a faith that comes from that regeneration, where we realize that there's now a new faith power, if we can say it that way, that I can now believe something that's beyond myself, when before all I could believe was things that happened to me and things that I thought and believed and felt. Here it's a whole new source, it's a whole new place. Repentance, and the ability to say, I'm sorry, I messed up, I can't go any further this way, I've got to turn around and go the other way. And then these other ones here are kind of eternity, future type things. Justification, sanctification, glorification. I mean, these are all fully fulfilled in what we call the glorification. But what does God do to sanctify us? There's two words that we think of sanctification, two ways we think of it. One is kind of a present tense where God says, I'm gonna sanctify you, meaning I'm gonna set you apart and make you different. So I think of a wedding ring. This wedding ring sanctifies me. This wedding ring says you are set apart, and it's a proof that your set apartness is just for one woman. So when anybody else looked at this ring, they may not know Shannon, they may not know the person, but they know one thing: I'm sanctified. I am set apart for another person, another purpose, another action, right? So we have sanctification here, and we also have the other part of sanctification, which is that continuing, ongoing growth work. That one of my Old Testament professors at ETBU said it this way: live in the light that you have, always open to more light, right? God's always going to show us more and more and more of who He is and His character through the circumstances that we encounter. I was talking to Scotty, my son-in-law, just the other night, and we were talking about they just celebrated their 4th anniversary. 4 years. They've been married for 4 years, right? And I asked him, I said, did you find it odd that you thought you loved Hannah when you first married her? But now the love that you have for her now makes that first love pale in comparison, right? The growth that we have is the same way. God says, I'm going to continue to show you and reveal to you. And another word picture I just thought of was, you remember that TV show about the construction, they built the house?
Extreme Makeover?
Extreme Makeover, that's what it's. No, yeah, Extreme Makeover. Remember that show? How did the end of the show happen? And then you knew once this happened, the tears are coming. Yes, that big bus, right? They had the picture on it, and what they say? Move that bus. I oftentimes have that in my mind when I think about when God reveals something to me. It's like God says, move that bus, and moves over, and there's a whole other space of my heart that I didn't even know existed. It happened when I married my wife. It happened when Hannah was born and the kids were born. It's like all of a sudden there's this new love that I didn't have before, a new part of me that I didn't have, and God's like, hey, move the bus. I'm going to move the bus, and you're going to be exposed to a whole new you, right? So it's pretty cool.
That kind of like in 3D for me when someone used the analogy of an acorn.
Okay.
Right, like an acorn has everything. It is an oak tree. It doesn't look like an oak tree, but everything that needs to be an oak tree is contained within that acorn. And that's the immediate sanctification, right? Like I am everything that Scripture tells me that I'm going to be, and that He makes me to be. I grow into it just like an acorn. I'm not more acorny or oaky, right, as I grow into it, but I'm just revealing what already was.
Yeah. So it's like when that sapling first generates that first set of gnarly bark, or whatever. I've oftentimes looked at that illustration too. Was the amazing part about all of this is that when we say I'm sanctified, meaning I'm an acorn, here's the miracle part of it for me, is that I wasn't an acorn before. I was an aspen tree, or I was a spruce, and I'm totally transformed now to be this other part. And to me, I'm like, that's this part here, man. I mean. And we see this over and over again. So this is what we talked about last week, or last time we met before Thanksgiving. And so now we're going to move into part 2. And we're going to look at the issue of identity and the issue of responsibility. I have resources. I'll share with you some of the resources. And we also have an exercise that... let me tell you what the exercise is so you can kind of think about it as we're going through this. It's a piece of cardboard and a marker. Back in the early whatever times, without dating myself, there was this thing that people did called cardboard testimony. And that's where on one side they wrote who they once were, and the other side they wrote who they are now. So some of the examples were like, I was an addict, but now I'm healed or sober, whatever. And I think I want us to do that tonight. Not share it unless you want to. And by sharing it, we oftentimes get encouraged by our own testimonies. But I want to at least put this exercise in front of us to go, I want us to feel it the way that Paul describes it here. And again, if you don't want to write it down, that's cool too. But because you can still experience that by just thinking, I'm about to write this down on this thing. It's permanent, right? So there's something about that. So we're going to do that at the end of this, at the end of this identity part. But I want to kind of give you the heads up, because I want you to think about how this plays out for us, how this applies to us. You ready? Let's go. So we're dealing with the issue of identity. This is supposed to be Onesimus, and there's 2 parts of Onesimus. Here's Onesimus before, angry, sullen, and here's Onesimus now. It's supposed to be peaceful, focused, pointed forward. Here, distracted, looking out other ways. What is the what transpires between these two. What turned this person into this person? And we know that it's already forgiveness and it's already salvation, but let's look at this issue of identity. But first of all, I want to talk about slavery for a second. And this is real, the real slavery, not antebellum slavery that we have in our country that was not just ours, but the latter part of last century. We're talking about a different kind of slavery. Still bad, but there's differences. And so Philemon, this is Philemon here. Philemon was a Roman. He was not Jewish. So his mindset towards slavery was a lot different than Paul's was. Now Paul understood Roman law. He called himself, "I am a Roman," but he is also very Jewish. So what are some of the difference between Jewish slavery and Roman slavery? And there are 4 basic categories that we can lump these things into: social status, legal status, and then the next category, a runaway and harboring. So when a slave runs away, and when a person harbors a runaway slave. So a key factor that I think is important for us to know about when we're looking at this idea of slavery between Onesimus between Philemon and Paul is that let's look at Philemon. With the Roman law, if you were a slave, you were a slave forever. You were a slave for a master could free his slave, but there was still a social status construed and carried on with that person. Now, there were stories of how slaves there were some slaves that were doctors, right? There were some slaves that were educators. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the slaves that were in Rome were educators and teachers. Probably feel like that even now today, especially in the world we have now. But but once a slave, always a slave. Once a slave, there was no rights. You were considered a non-person. And you could be exploited in all sorts of ways. You could be exploited physically, you could be exploited sexually, you could be exploited. There was no limit to what a person could do with their slaves by law, legally. There was no. So Onesimus or Philemon kind of grew up with that understanding of slaves, and he was a wealthy man. Was his wealth inherited? Did he generate his wealth? I'm not sure, but you could probably guess, or we could summarize or think about. What's that? We could guess that he was at least hobnobbing with other wealthy people who mistreated their slaves or had this Roman worldview of slavery. I don't think, and it's apparent by the way that Paul describes Philemon, that he probably was not a bad slave owner. He probably treated his slaves well. But his understanding of a Roman slave was the exception. His treatment was the exception of that. Now, Paul, the Jewish side of slavery, totally different. If you were a Hebrew, you couldn't enslave another Hebrew. Now, let me say that carefully, because a Hebrew, a Jewish person, could put themselves into indentured service to you, and you would be their slave for kind of a voluntary way. You could be a slave to a Hebrew could be a slave of another Hebrew, another Jew, by a legal punishment. If there was a debt that was owed, if there was a crime that was committed, the ruling council could say you are going to work your debt off, whether it's monetarily or physically. You could work that debt off. And But the key factor for this, for a Jew, was called the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee was the year where everything was set free. If you had a slave, if you had somebody that was in your service, and the year of Jubilee came along, you set them free. And they were free. They're free from all debt. The year of Jubilee carried on to the way the farmers planted their field. They would plant a field for 6 years, enslave it for 6 years. The year of Jubilee, they would take it and they would plant another plot of land and set this plot of land free. And it would grow as it wanted to. So the year of Jubilee, every year, or every 7 years, slaves were freed. That was not the case for Romans. A slave could buy their way out of slavery without consent of the owner. So, and it was prorated. So if there was if the slave had 40 denarii and he was supposed to pay back 60, and 2 years into his slavery with the master, that 2 years counted towards that 60. So and I'm using these numbers arbitrarily. I don't know what the actual rate of exchange was between money and slavery. But just for example, if a slave owed 60, they served for 2, they only owed a portion of that 60. And they could pay back that portion, they were set free. Once they were set free, legally, socially, they were considered freemen. They were free as anyone else was, whether it be from a debt payment, whether it be from the action of the master, or whether it be from the year of Jubilee. They were free and free forever. Okay, next thing here, the next part of it here is runaway and harboring. There was no whole lot of things about runaway or harboring. Let me back up for a second. There were other things about slavery with Jews, with the Jewish law. If you were an enemy, you could be enslaved, and that was a little more permanent. If you were a non-Jew, that was a little more permanent, but you were still able to be freed fully by the master and by the year of Jubilee. So let's go back to runaway and harboring, and we're going to focus mostly on Roman law. A runaway slave was a really bad idea because under Roman law, you had a sense of protection, a sense of, because you were property of another master, you had that protection of the master. So if you were caught by a Roman military person, and they would appeal to your master, and then your master would take over from there. But if you ran away, there's no master. You are out of the umbrella of protection. You have no rights whatsoever, none. And so anybody could do anything to you, with you. Another person could enslave you. Another person could do all these things. So why would a Roman run away? Why would Onesimus risk running away from Philemon in the first place? Most likely because of sometimes what we call a fanciful tale or romanticized version of stories of slaves who won their freedom from gladiatorial things. It's like when a young man says, I want to be a football player and I want to play for the Dallas Cowboys. Well, the chances of that likely happening are really, really small, right? But people still try, and they sacrifice and sacrifice and sacrifice and sacrifice, and it's so hard to get that. Kind of the same thing for Onesimus. So when he ran away, he was probably thinking that he was going to run away to somewhere that was going to be of his benefit, which is probably why he found himself near Rome, where Paul was in prison in Rome. some people, this is a side note, some people think that Paul wrote, and at this time he was in prison in Caesarea Maritima, which is against the Mediterranean coast, kind of where Gaza Strip is now. But but most people think that he was in Rome, and it makes sense because why would Onesimus run anywhere else but towards Rome? So running away towards Rome. The next thing is harboring a slave. So I said that a person could catch a slave, and there were slave catchers. That was an actual trade back then. People would go out and try to catch as many slaves as they could. I think of Dog the Bounty Hunter, So they would go out there and they would just, that's all they did, was try to find and chase runaway slaves. But you could harbor a slave, meaning that you could hide a slave from authorities. If you did that, it's almost like you were relinquishing some of their non-rights transferred to you. It was not looked upon highly for people to harbor or hide a runaway slave from the Roman government. And so you could be punished severely to the point of death. Runaway slaves were at risk of being killed and murdered, and so is true for those that harbored a slave. The issue that we find here in this situation between Philemon and Onesimus is the Roman side. So even though that Philemon's a Christian, and even though that Philemon is a friend of Paul, he still is understanding the Roman side of slavery, and especially Onesimus is understanding the Roman side of slavery.
Steve?
Yes.
Did this happen frequently, that slaves ran away? Because it seems to me, I've often wondered how he was able to do this and get away with it. It seems like that.
It was pretty rampant, mostly because most Roman masters were not kind to their slaves, and so there was enough people running away from each other, from their masters, to actually kind of create a business for it, and.
Seems like it would be hard for him to get to Rome as a runaway slave.
Right, which is another. I'm guessing here why he might have been a young man, because if you were anything older than 19, how running away from Colossae up over, cross a strait and into Rome, that's kind of a jump, but that apparently happened a lot, and it apparently was all over the place. It's a great insight, great question, because it happened a lot, and so. Under Roman law, Philemon had the full rights of the law to do whatever he wanted to do to Onesimus if Onesimus was ever returned back to Philemon, up until the point of execution. Philemon had the full right to kill Onesimus for running away. And that comes into play in a little bit, probably, maybe we'll cover it a little bit tonight, but mostly next week. No, I'm looking at the time. We will not be able to cover it tonight, I promise. But we do know that Onesimus, as a runaway slave, understood the ramifications of what he was doing. He was running away, and as such, it's very clear. Not by reading the text, but just knowing that history, that Onesimus most likely knew what he was running into and away from. He didn't know he was going to meet Paul, for sure. And when Onesimus was caught and brought to Rome, he probably thought his life was over. When he was thrown into prison, he was just waiting for his execution to be made. And most likely looks like he got thrown either next door to Paul or in the same cell as Paul. And that's where we begin this next part of Onesimus' journey. So let's look at Philemon, verse 11. And this is Paul in a parenthetical statement. He says this kind of as a word play, and we left last week kind of talking about this. So the name, everybody's name means something. We talked about that last week. Everybody's name means something. Most people, the name means something. Same is true for back then. So Onesimus, which is Philemon's servant, Philemon's runaway slave, Onesimus' name means useful. It means useful. So when Paul says this phrase, he goes, formerly he, Philemon, was useless to you. He's making a wordplay. He's drawing out something in Philemon, probably causing Philemon to chuckle a little bit. But now we know where Philemon's reading this, and I picture he's at the door, and whether Philemon or whether Onesimus was around the corner, we don't know. But I picture him kind of around the corner, going, "Oh, sweet Jesus, please, 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 please," right? But Tychicus is there, and because he just delivered the letter. So Philemon is reading the letter, and I can picture him kind of chuckling. For he was useless to you. And apparently useless, there's some verses later on in the letter that a little bit describe how useless he was. Sounds like he was a criminal. Sounds like he was not careful with anything, maybe broke things, maybe destroyed things on purpose, stole some things. But he was definitely useless in so many ways. It's very clear that Onesimus was useless to you. But now he is indeed useful to you and to me. So we've looked at this idea of his salvation. So what transformed him into, so we can understand what spiritually happened. But let's look into this next part here. This transformation. There's three things I want us to kind of focus in on. What we see is Philemon, or Onesimus. Paul is describing Onesimus in a whole new way. It's a transformative way. And he alludes to three different things. One, he says Onesimus is going from slavery to family member. I don't need to tell you how huge that is. From becoming a slave to becoming a family member is in this case a huge transformation. I think of it this way. It's a different word picture, but before I was a Christian, I was dead to God. There was no life in me. I did not have agape life in me. Dead. I think I've told you guys, I before I came here, I was a funeral director, assistant funeral director, and I saw dead people. And there's one very clear thing about dead people. It is very evident. You look at them, it is like you can just see that there's nothing a dead person can do. Absolutely nothing. To go from being dead to becoming an heir, to become part of a family, is huge. This is the same idea. Going from a slave, where you have no rights, your life is not yours at all, to now becoming a family member, to where now you are saying brother, sister, mom, dad. I think I probably can say in this room that we have this kind of relationship with people, where we have people in our life where we can say, my grandparents live in another state, but God's given us other spiritual grandparents, given us other spiritual family members that have really invested in us. This is the idea. So when Paul says he's like my heart, he's describing something pretty powerful. And then we talked about this already, going from useless to useful. This is where I want to start thinking about this cardboard piece of paper in front of you. Do you remember those moments? Do you remember that time in your life when you felt like there was no value to you? It seemed like everybody was not. I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to project onto myself, but I was constantly fighting for value. I felt myself going, I need to try to give myself value somehow, some way. And sometimes I was wanting to do just outrageous things to try to find value with my friends, mostly my friends, and that just continued and continued and continued, because I felt useless. I felt like there was no importance to my life. I remember sitting on the floor of my living room when I was a kid, and I remember thinking, if this is all life has, then something has to change, because I'm not getting what I think I need here. So but then going to useful. If you would have told my teenage self what I do right now, I don't. Well, I know for certain that my teenage self would not have believed you. Number one, I hated talking in front of people. And even to this day, I kind of feel like I have to work through a tape in my mind. I just dated myself. I have to work through a message in my mind that says, if I have an idea and there's a group, we're talking about things, a staff meeting, it happens a lot. I have an idea. I literally have to push this idea through a filter that I have in my mind. And here's what my filter says. They don't want to hear what you have to say. What you have to say is maybe probably a little off the wall, not important. Don't worry about it. Maybe talk to someone in private, but don't bring it from the group. They're not going to hear you. And I have to push myself through that. Now,
but because your ideas are off the wall, we do want to hear them.
but I still have to push it through that, because there's things. Now, we've joked about this in our family. My youngest son, Wesley, he has a whole different tape, a whole different filter his goes through. And his is, why wouldn't people want to hear my idea? My idea is fantastic. It's great. And that's why he does the things he does. But this idea of useless to useful, I didn't think I was of value to my parents, to my family, to my friends, but now God has put me in a place where I'm in the bone and marrow of life. The ministry that I have is this edge of cliffs, where I'm keeping people from, or warning people from going off the cliff. I'm warning people and growing. Look, I got goosebumps. Every day, I'm thankful that I can come to a place where God has called me to this ministry. From a runaway to my very heart. Paul says it this way. This is Greek. It's if you want to know what this says, this Greek word says splachna. It's not heart. Splachna, literally, is bowels, and that's in this time frame, in this period. When you said, I love you with all my heart, they would never say that. Paul would never say, I love you with all my heart. He would say, I love you with all my bowels. You can't put that on a Hallmark card. Well, you could, I guess. I might try it, but we'll see how that works. But if you think about it, I mean, there's a lot of activity that happens down here, right? If you feel nervous, where do you feel it? Do you feel it here? No, you feel it here. What's that? If you're excited, you feel it here. So it makes sense. It's all right here. They mean to say the center of our feelings, and so we in the Western, this more modern world, we say it's the heart. So our center of emotions for us is we say it's in our heart. For Paul, it's splachna. And I just put that there just for our own amusement for a second, just to go, hey, Aaron, let's do this, right? We'll just go to our wives and say, I love you with all my splachna. I mean, and to have our wives go, oh, that means so much to me, thank you, right? Or we could all do this. So husbands, let's all pitch in money together for Valentine's Day, and let's hire a skywriter to write splachna in the sky, right? Let's do that. Mark's going, I don't know why. No. But the idea here is going from a runaway. You get the idea, though, right? Runaway to where a runaway is someone who's rebellious. A runaway is someone who's avoiding things. A runaway is somebody who's trying to get away from hurt, from life. I think of Onesimus, and I think of him just saying, I have to get out of here. Whatever it takes, I have to get out of here. I'm willing to risk whatever it is. Whatever he thought was happening in the household of Philemon, he apparently said, I've got to get out of here. To now, Paul says, he's my heart. I mean, do you see that transformation? It's so significant. It talks about this topic of identity. There's so many things that's happening here in this little letter that we can all just kind of emote with all three characters, with Paul, with Philemon, and especially here with Onesimus. Could you imagine being Onesimus and realizing in this jail cell you've become a family member, you've become useful, and you've become someone's bowels? I mean, right? In prison, where you thought it was going to be the most horrible thing ever. Colossians was written right alongside of Philemon, and you can hear it in Colossians. It's evident in so many ways that Paul was probably writing at the same time like this. One hand was on Philemon, one hand was on Colossians. Look what he says here. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self. You see that language of transformation there? You have a whole new set of clothes. You have a whole new set of values. You have a whole new set of fill in the blank. I mean, think about your card. Which is being renewed in knowledge. We talked about that earlier when it comes to sanctification. Being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. This is the source of authority, the image of its creator. This is part of that triune godness, the image of God that we see in Adam and Eve. It's being reclaimed here by Paul. Here, in this place, there is not Greek and Jew. So I told you that Philemon was a Greek, and Paul was a Jew. Paul's saying, no, it's gone. There is no Greek and Jew. Circumcised and uncircumcised. Now that's a fighting phrase right there for a lot of Jews, because that's how you were identified. That's how you were part of the in crowd. Now I don't know how they proved that, but I knew Brian would laugh at that. I really did. And I will edit that for sure. Circumcised and uncircumcised. That's how you. When we, as Baptists and Protestants, when we baptize, that's an important part of our faith journey, because we are identifying with we're identifying with the body of faith that we have here. So when we're baptized, a part of a church, we're baptized as family in that church, but we're also being baptized into what Christ did for us. What Christ from the cross to the resurrection. The same thing was true for the circumcision. Shannon.
I remember what Alan taught during Wesley's baptism that I didn't know was that you could become a Christian and you wouldn't be persecuted until you were baptized.
Yep.
And as soon as you were baptized, you were open for persecution.
Yep. So in closed countries, especially in the Middle East, you can say, I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian, all you want. And most people will ignore you. But if you got baptized, that's when they thought, that's where it's like an evidence that you're serious. And I'm remembering too what he said too at Wesley's baptism was he said, we're baptized part of a church, we're baptized part of a family of faith, but we're also the family of Christians of eons. And that's eons probably too big of a word. But from John the Baptist all the way to today, for 2,000 some years, people have been baptized and we're joining that family. I mean, that's pretty cool right there. So circumcised and uncircumcised. This is a powerful statement, equating this with circumcision. Barbarian, Scythian. Here it is. Slave and free. There's no difference. But Christ is all and in all. This is to say, Paul is saying, if you're a Greek, Christ is in you. If you're a Jew, Christ is in you as a Christian. If you're a slave, if you're a Christian slave, which there were, and I guess you could say at this moment here, Onesimus is a Christian slave, Christ is in you. If you're free, Christ is in you. At the same amount. There's no differing levels. Barbarian, Scythian, it's all the same. It touches on the condition that we are in when it comes to what Paul says. All are sinners. No. All are rebellious. Before we were Christians, a Greek could be just as rebellious as a Jew could be rebellious, right? Circumcised, uncircumcised, it didn't matter. You could be rebellious there. A barbarian, a slave, or a free person could be just as rebellious. But here he says, just like that, Christ healed all of that, took care of all of that. Christ is all, and in all.